But when asked whether their institution has a good definition of student success and one that staff members understand, only 34% strongly agreed with that. So my takeaway is that almost everyone has student success in their strategy, but perhaps only a minority seem to be in strong consensus about what the goal is. That data comes from a recent Chronicle survey, which had responses from more than 400 provosts, presidents, deans, and other senior administrators. The respondents worked at both 4-year and 2-year colleges and universities, both private and public, and they were located all across the country. We're using the findings from that survey today to jump into conversation about setting the right strategy for student success at your institution. Hello, everyone. I'm Ian Wilhelm, an editor with the Chronicle. I really appreciate all of you being here today. I've got a great panel to help me better understand the topic and the issues around setting strategy for student success, and I really look forward to hearing from them. I also want to say I look forward to hearing from you. Please do use the Q&A to let me know what you'd like to hear from the panel, and also share your own opinions and advice in the Q&A. We've enabled it so you can respond directly to other commenters in the Q&A, and so you can create conversations there around today's topic. Please do engage with us as well as your fellow attendees there too. It's really great to see a robust conversation. And I do just want to add that the Q&A is really valuable to us here at the Chronicle to see what you're talking about, what you're asking about, because it does help shape our coverage. And I do share the comments and questions with the rest of the newsroom so we can think more deeply about topics like this one of student success. Before we get started, I do want to thank the underwriter for today's discussion, and that's Ellucian. We really appreciate their support for the virtual discussion. Halfway through today's session, I'll invite Liz McMillan, the Chronicle's executive editor, to join. Liz will interview Laquia Purcell, Senior Director of Digital Transformation at Ellucian. I also want to note that the company had also supported the survey I mentioned. A report that explores the results is now available for download. That report was written by our Chronicle contributor, David Wheeler, and edited by my colleague, Maura Mahoney. We're going to put a link to that report in the chat. But don't worry if your Zoom settings don't allow you to open the link in the chat. We'll also be sending the link to you in an email following the session. So no need to go chasing those links when we send them out. We're going to get them, make sure they get them all of them to you as well. Now, let me introduce my panel who in alphabetical order by last name. This is John Gunkel, is the Senior Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs and Strategic Partnerships at Rutgers University's Newark campus. Cynthia Hernandez is the Vice President for Student Success at Texas State University. Greg Rathert is the Vice President of Academic and Student Affairs at St. Paul College. And Sarah Whitley is the Vice President of the Center for First Generation Student Success with NASPA. Thank you all for being here. I really appreciate it. Now, I do want to ask all of you to sort of start off to introduce your institution and how you describe your student success strategy. I know that's a big question and perhaps a little bit unfair to say do it briefly. But if you could sort of focus sort of on the latest evolution of it, that would be great. Because I do want to make sure people know where you're coming from, how you're approaching this big topic, and see how they relate to it as well. So Cynthia, I was going to start with you on this. How do you think of your student success strategy? How has it evolved in recent years at Texas State?
Sure, Ian. And one thing to know a little bit about Texas State, because obviously the composition of your institution and your student body is going to really play into what your strategy is,
Yeah, exactly.
right? So at Texas State, we're a 4-year public institution. We have about 39,000 students on campuses, both in San Marcos, Texas, and in Round Rock, Texas, deep in the heart of Texas. We're both a Hispanic serving institution, as well as recognized as a minority serving institution. We have 43% of our students who identify as first generation. So we are very familiar with Sarah and the wonderful efforts from the First Gen Center. We have about 36% of our students who are also Pell eligible, and about 40% of our students are coming in with some dual credit as well. So all of those things play into what our strategy is and how our strategy has changed over the years as well. So, you know, I've been here for about 2.5 years, and long before I got here, Texas State has been engaged in student success efforts around a culture of care philosophy, really meeting students where they are and serving their needs. As we had a new president, President Danfus, come in about 1.5 years ago, he really gave the charge to elevate student success, not to start student success because we've had it, but to elevate it on our campus. And that really inspired us to take a look and take a deeper dive into what might be the barriers to success for students completing at Texas State, as well as what do our students need, as well as what does our community, region, and state need in terms of providing a workforce to help us set metrics for post-graduation success as well.
Thanks for that, Cynthia. I appreciate it. And of course, you make the great statement that, hey, your strategy has to be about the students and the student population that you're serving. I think that it couldn't be articulated more, right? That's a great point, underlined more, because obviously is a part of what you have to set your strategy as. John, I was going to go to you with this just because as another public, kind of curious about how you think about this question of having a student success strategy and how you at Rutgers at the Newark campus are thinking about it.
Thank you, Ian. Great to see everybody today. Again, a little context. Rutgers University, Newark is about 14,000 students, about 8,000 of whom are undergraduates. So we have a very large graduate population where over half of our student undergraduates are Pell eligible, and a third are first generation students. And we're also an HSI, and we're also an APESI institution. So we have we have a wonderful and complex student body that we work with all the time. And our work really has come from a strategic plan that is almost 10 years old. And unlike some strategic plans, I mean, they're done in all kinds of different ways, but ours really came from a voice of community. We had Shrek groups across campus that were really kind of feeding ideas, and it really highlighted a number of directions that the community wanted to focus upon. One was engagement with the city of Newark. We are the second largest unit within campus within Rutgers, in the state's largest city. But it worked with the city, but also work in supporting our students. And it's really been threefold because we have very large Pell recipient population. We focused a lot on affordability questions. Because again, we have a lot of first generation students, we focused a lot on student navigation, student engagement, student support, and we also have focused on the academic side. So it's really been in terms of student success, it's really been trying to take each of these areas on together and in support of our students.
John, I appreciate the succinctness of that, but also the idea of bringing the voice of the community, and I think that's something interesting, perhaps worth diving into more fully. Hey, Greg, I want to talk to you. Obviously, you're a private institution. You're and different than some of the other these campuses here, kind of thinking about, hey, how are you thinking about this issue from your perspective, from your location, and from the type of institution that you all are?
Yeah, hi, everyone. Actually, St. Paul College is a public, non-residential.
I should know that.
That's all right. So we're a comprehensive community and technical college, and we're in St. Paul, Minnesota. So a little context, like the other presenters, we have an enrollment of about 8,500 students. We're the most racially diverse college in the Minnesota State College and University system, with about 65% of our students identifying as students of color. 60% of our students are also first gen, and our average age is 25, which is pretty typical, I think, of two-year colleges. And the majority of our students attend part-time. So in the wake of the murder of George Floyd in May 2020, St. Paul College committed to becoming an anti-racist, trauma-informed institution, which is something that's infused throughout our student success planning as we strive to eliminate student outcome gaps in a variety of measures across demographic categories by 2030. And we're really focusing on eliminating those gaps within the categories of race, ethnicity, and Pell eligibility. Like many of you, our student success strategy is multifaceted, and it focuses on combining the principles of guided learning pathways with relationship-rich instructional and advising approaches to better meet students where they're at. We're also committed to being more data-informed in our efforts to better focus and prioritize our efforts on those practices and strategies that have the greatest positive impact on our students.
Greg, I appreciate that, and thank you again for the correction. As you're being a public institution, I should know that. And also the point of sort of bringing data informed. This is obviously something that has been a big growth in terms of how people are thinking about their student success, in terms of knowing their students better, collecting more data, analyzing that data, and then of course making interventions that work better to keep students on the path to graduation. So another area worth exploring. Sarah, you're not at a campus, but you're at a center that's been working focused on this issue of first generation. As some of the folks on the panel mentioned, many of their students are first generation. I would love to make sure that people know, are familiar with your center. If you could talk a little bit about what your work is, but also when it comes to this question of a student success strategy, what are some of the basics, places that you're recommending folks to think more deeply about, perhaps? So tell us a little bit about the center and just a little bit about the topic too, before we get a chance to go too far.
Sure. Thanks so much, everyone, for joining us today and for the opportunity to have some conversation. I was super excited to hear the percent first gen given by my fellow panelists. I always love when that information is a part of the opening introduction. As Ian said, the Center for First Generation Student Success is a partnership between NASPA and the Suter Foundation, and we were established in 2017. What makes our work unique is that people often believe that we're an access organization, and while we fully support access efforts, we work directly with colleges and universities across the country to make sure that they're prepared for the first generation students they're recruiting. We are continuing across higher ed to recruit first gen students into environments that are not adequately prepared to deliver this promise of success that higher ed is making to these students. And so we get to do work with really wonderful institutions like Texas State, who have made big public commitments to supporting first gen students. And for us, our success strategy is around institutional change. We can't continue to put the onus on students to navigate the complexities of higher ed. We have to really help institutions think about how they can become more nimble to really do this work and to serve student need. And that looks a lot of things, and we'll get into that today, but aligning institutional leadership, institutional mapping, improving data systems and definitional alignment around first gen. It's a whole host of things that we can dig into. We do a lot of that work in the center through our National First Scholars Network. And that's something right now has about 350 institutions nationally, but we work with a lot of institutions beyond that through original research, professional development. We have a national conference on student success and first gen as a component of that. Policy and advocacy work, and we lead National First Generation College Celebration in partnership with the Council for Opportunity and Education and really the TRIO community. So a lot of pieces of the puzzle moving together and working there to think specifically about first gen efforts. And it's always kind of a silly thing to say, but when you do good work for first gen students, it helps all of your students. And so it's really an important lens to think about as we're talking about student success.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Sarah. A quick description of a lot of work that you all do, and talking about how the sort of first generation connects to a lot of different students, not just those who may be defined as first generation. But when we're talking about definitions, I want to stick with you for a second, Sarah, because I mentioned that earlier about the percentage here. So I said earlier about 34% of the survey respondents, again, strongly agree that their institution had the definition of student success that staff members understand. Do you see that as a concern? And then I'll go around and open this up to the rest of the panel too. But how do you get everybody on the same page about how are we defining this idea of student success? In many ways, it's a term that can mean different things for different campuses. And so just kind of thinking, Sarah, from your perspective, what do you do to get on the same page? How do you define it?
Yeah, I think it's a really important question. And I absolutely agree that it has lost its meaning. I lead an organization that has student success in the title. And I think sometimes that it has lost its meaning. For me, and granted, I have a bit of a lens on this with first gen, it reminds me a little bit of the challenges we're having around definitional alignment around the first gen identity.
Right.
Over time, it's become really complicated and confusing. I think in general, we can agree that student success, we want students to persist through college. We want them to obtain a degree. We want them to go on to meaningful and productive lives. But that can also get really messy. Is it levels of performance? Is it GPA? Is it the time it takes you to get through the degree program? Is it getting a job that means you're using your major? Is it a certain first salary? I think that's where it all gets really confusing. I think, and I'm not the expert here on this, but for community and technical colleges, there's not, in my opinion, not nearly enough benefit placed on the successful transfer of a student, and that actually being a type of success, even if they haven't completed at that point. So I think we've got a long way to go in reimagining what does student success mean. Some of the institutions that we work with have a really hard time getting the folks to see that what is the big picture and how is it tied to the strategic plan? And what are we actually trying to accomplish as an institution? We're so stuck down in the weeds of our day-to-day work, and we're losing sight of that big picture. So I think our conversation around I don't know if it's an official definition, but a lot of clarity around student success is something we certainly need to get behind.
Yeah, I hear you on the point of like having one never changing definition doesn't make sense, but it really gets back to some of the things that Cynthia was saying. Hey, we have to think about our student population and how we define it. And I'm curious if the audience has any suggestions about how they define it. Please do put in the Q&A because I'll be reading those as well. Cynthia, how do you think about it at your institution in terms of coming up with a definition that the staff members, obviously one that can evolve, it's a working definition, but one that you think that the staff members do understand, so they can obviously fulfill the goals that when they are put into the strategic plan and they talk about student success broadly.
Yeah, and Sarah brings up such good points because we are constantly also having student success defined for us from external stakeholders as well, right? So we're always balancing that as well as what we believe within the institution, and we have to take note of that in how we're setting. Sarah mentioned college completion metrics, right? Persistence, retention, graduation. That's the main reason students are here, right? At least at our institutions, right, is to progress them along that academic pathway to lead them to what they want to do post-graduation. For us, we've said for a long time trying to come up with a definition of student success, and our presidential commission has one out there. But I find when we're talking about this with stakeholders and community members, it's a lot easier to talk about this through more of a framework conversation than a definition conversation, right? So my close friend and colleague, Julie Payne Kirchmeyer at the University of Indiana system has been working on some with her colleagues, and we've been tweaking a little bit around a framework that really focuses on different elements, right? It's bringing in the literature around health and well-being, right? The student success literature, as well as the student development and student engagement literature as well, in what might be those impediments for students to be able to persist through graduation, and then what are also those elements that we need to be offering that adds value to their education that helps them attain those post-graduation success initiatives as well. So, and my colleagues here have mentioned those around even just basic needs, health and well-being, engagement and involvement, academic pathways, career readiness, and engagement, right? So just big clusters, and how we enter into each of those may depend on the student that we're working with and the campus that we're on as well.
Yeah, we have a commenter who says, really it should be defined by each individual student. I'm sure that's how we want to get to it ultimately, because it's really up to the students, but obviously we have to have our program set up in a broader way. And I hear you about the point of maybe not pushing on the definition, but pushing on a framework, which moves it to a different sort of broader conversation. John, Greg, I wonder if you want to jump in here, John, about, hey, how do you think about this? Maybe not a definition, maybe it's more of a framework, but how do you make sure, again, that we're all on the same page when it comes to your campus, when you're moving forward on a goal?
Yeah, we spent absolutely zero time trying to come up with the definition of student success. I think the attitude has been, well, let's just work on it and we'll figure it out as we go. But I do think that there are two main concepts that I think come in, or at least kind of points that I would say that our staff and faculty recognize pretty much across the board as being a hallmark. One is focusing on social mobility, so which is not just about graduation rates and post-graduation outcomes, although we do focus on those, but it's also about kind of maintaining Sarah was mentioning access and was talking about transfer. For us, even though the community college population in New Jersey had been shrinking fairly rapidly for quite a while, we doubled down our efforts to really open up those channels, because we know that for a lot of students that coming through community college to a four-year research university like ours is an important path for social mobility. And so so it means focusing on all aspects, who our students are, where they're coming from, and as well as where they're going. And the other side of it too is that again, as much as we want to focus on student mobility, and the comment that you mentioned, and the chat kind of speaks to it, is we also focus on the quality of the student experience. And you know, we might be able to get them the best jobs, but if they're having a miserable time and they feel like they're being treated ill and you know, or whatever, it's not a win for us. But we're really focusing on constantly improving the experience of the students as they're going through the in the classroom, on campus. Most of our students are commuters. We'd love to be able to do something about New Jersey traffic, but you know, no success so far. But also, you know, prospective students and alumni too. So it's, you know, so it's really social mobility and quality of student experience that represent, I think, the hallmarks for student success for our staff and faculty.
Yeah, if you could help us clean up the Garden State and the Parkway and all that, that'd be great. I appreciate that for my own trip to see the in-laws. But yeah, I appreciate the sort of the definition of also with the student experience. Someone had mentioned in the comments about the importance of question we can get to later about the idea of belonging, right? This is something that's come up more and more so in some ways, so it's not necessarily a new idea. But again, that gets back to the student experience. Greg, I want to bring you in, make sure we've got your perspective on this too from St. Paul about how do you think about, again, I feel like the asking the question of how you define it may not be a fair one as I kind of evolved with your answers. It's more of like, what are the big goals? And when you say, hey, what do we think about when we think about student success and our students?
Yeah, I mean, I could just say like all the above. I feel like
Sure.
a lot of what people have already said sort of resonate with me. I mean, as part of a state system, we have prescribed student success measures as well, and that certainly is one lens. I would say, you know, amid the ongoing pressures around the value proposition of higher education and our aspirational goals, as John mentioned, to serve as a lever of upward mobility, we've kind of been rethinking this a little bit. And our president, as quoted in the article that Ian was talking about earlier, has kind of issued a challenge to us that kind of serves as a proxy, I think, for how we're defining student success. And it's really all around increasing the number of our BIPOC students who are graduating and transferring in programs that lead to sustaining high demand careers by 2028. So with that lens, it's really around helping students participate in programming and complete and progress towards family sustaining wage, high demand careers, which is moving away from that education for education's sake model. And I feel like we're just getting increasing pressure from the legislature around this. The public opinion, of course, is kind of pushing us in this direction. So I think we're just wanting to embrace it and seeing what we can do with it.
Appreciate that, Greg. I do want to keep on this topic of kind of the internal conversation, but it's not just the conversation. What I mean is here is we talk about here, maybe the definition doesn't have to all be the same. We don't have to all accept the change definition, but we have to be on the same page. And I think often we hear so much at the Chronicle about, I'm trying to avoid the cliche of breaking silos, but the importance of decentralization, the importance of getting away and teams working together. And I'll just point to the survey that we had that decentralization and siloed efforts, quote unquote, was the second biggest barrier identified by respondents to kind of succeeding and having a good strategy. The first biggest challenge was budget concerns. And that's a little bit harder to deal with in many ways. You can't always control it. But in terms of the siloed challenges of campuses, we've heard a lot about it. I'm kind of curious how you all have kind of tried to overcome that, to kind of get together. Sometimes I know there have been student persistent teams that have been created on some campuses. Sometimes, obviously, there's a person with a title of student success in it that helps with that and has that authority. Cynthia, I sort of pointed to you with that one. Just kind of curious, like, how do you get past those siloed efforts? How do you make sure that on your campus that you all are kind of that different parts of the campus are working together?
Yeah, and I think we're really working towards that. And one, as you talked about, again, with 39,000 students, you can imagine that we have a number of units who are all looking towards supporting students and elevating student success. But we want to make sure that we don't take a shotgun approach to this, right? We all work in limited resources environments, so we want to make sure that we're being strategic and thoughtful about how we're investing resources in these efforts. To your point about how we break down the silos, I think commissions, committees, having the conversation, right? Having the intentional and sometimes difficult conversations of where are we overlapping? Where are we duplicating? What makes sense? Where do we sunset programs that are no longer being beneficial? Getting in and really having those tough conversations. That was one of the things that President Danfus charged our commission with, is think out of the box and think big, right? And so one, having that support from leadership is essential. And then two, making sure there's communication, whether that's through committees sometimes, and I know we have are adopting, right, a platform to help us, a technology that will help us communicate more and share information. We need to get out of the practice of being information hoarders and data hoarders to really sharing information, so that anybody who's working with a student has the appropriate holistic picture of that student, right? To be able to make sure we're doing the best interventions that we can. So I'll stop there. Those are some of the main things, but communication is the key.
Appreciate that, Cynthia. John, Greg, Sarah, anything you want to add to that? Because I know it can be a big topic. John, I saw you came off mute.
Yeah,
Over to you.
I agree with the sentiment communication. I mean, for us, our Chancellor Nancy Cantor has been involved in this work for a long time and is constantly engaged with us. It's it's not an arm's length relationship. We work very closely with her. And also our team has overlapped a lot. So, for example, even though I was Dean of Undergraduate Education for a number of years, I moved over to be the Vice Chancellor for Enrollment Management for a while, and created what's now our largest scholarship program, changed the way that we do admissions, moving enrollment, say, from the city of Newark from about 7% of our undergraduate population to 15%. So just shifting the way that we do admissions. So I had experience with enrollment management before I came back to academic affairs. Similarly, our current vice chancellor for enrollment management, his background is in student affairs. And so, having overlapping and being able to work, and I know there are institutions that like to have a more centralized approach to student support, but I think that for us, we found that as long as that kind of communication that Cynthia mentioned is there between the chancellor and us, and kind of horizontally across the team, we benefit from having different perspectives, different priorities, and really being able to to be able to see things that that our colleagues might not, and vice versa. So it's been a wonderful dynamic working relationship for us, and I think that the students are the main beneficiaries.
Oh, John, I appreciate it, because I also think, not to suggest that a centralized approach is always going to work for, depending on the type of campus, it may not work for you all, may not work for others, in terms of, again, it's getting back to the idea, if there's communication there, then that can ultimately solve some of these challenges. Greg, Sarah, I need to pause here in a few, just quickly, but I just want to make sure you all have a chance also to jump in on this, because I know it's a big topic. Again, we hear it at the Chronicle all the time about being so much of a persistent challenge.
Yeah, I might just jump in.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead. No, go ahead, John. Go ahead, Greg.
All right, I'll be quick. I would just complicate this a bit, just to say that I think silos aren't always so overt, right? And so I think the most difficult silos to overcome are often those mental models within the organizational culture itself. You can change the org charts and broaden meeting rosters, but if those entrenched attitudes, beliefs, and habits remain, those silos remain, and if anything, just become more hidden. So I think it's an introspective process too, where you really have to get in there and invite people to think about their roles in a way that fosters connection.
Love that comment, Greg. I think that's really, really interesting, and a harder one to change, because that seems like we're getting at questions of culture, not just sort of, as you said, the org chart, which I was sort of presenting it as. Sarah, please, I want to make sure we get your comment in here too.
Yeah, I just wanted to highlight the couple of comments that have come up just about the importance of leadership in this work. We often find that student success work often gets thrust upon the person that has the closest title that says student success, something with it. Or in our work, the TRIO programs on our campus that are positioned to do this work, or the people who are just kind-hearted and really think that there's value in supporting students in certain ways. We often get pegged as, oh, you're going to come in and tell us you've got to build a first gen center, you got to hire a big team. And And that's not it. We actually want to do the work that Greg was just mentioning of saying, how do we build teams that bring together different cabinet level leaders, different folks doing work across the community? How do you position champions across schools and colleges to be a part of a conversation, but they understand the clear direction that we're trying to work toward? And we try to break down siloing as much as you can, but it's impossible in higher education. So breaking down, I appreciated your perspective, Greg. You have to break down kind of the mindset of it and think about how we can work collaboratively and be part of a larger conversation. And so I just appreciated the way that came together.
If I can, with
please.
just building on what John said, right? There will never be one office who can do all this work, because student success is really the work of everyone. And I know we'll probably get to that in one of the other answers or questions here. But, you know, a lot of campuses have moved to somewhat of a hub and spoke kind of model, right? Or at least somebody who is continuing to champion and to bring data forward and to remind us of that we need to continuously look at our efforts, right? But this is really something that's done by faculty, by staff, and students across the campuses. So.
Yeah, Cynthia, I appreciate that. That's a great point. I mean, I hear from all of you, you know, communication. I love the idea of positioning champions in the right spots, as Sarah said, and getting past those mental models, perhaps, as Greg was saying. These are all really interesting points. Perhaps we can pick up on the second half of this conversation, because I do want to pause here in a second for our sponsor segment with Ellucian. I am going to ask the audience, though, a question before we get started. So I was picking on that idea of working off a common definition. I'm going to give it a little bit of a change and spin, and I'm going to launch this poll. I'm asking about that. But based on what Cynthia said, let's also substitute the word framework in there as well, not just definition, because I do hear that kind of feedback. So I'm starting this poll. I'm going to leave it open. You know, let me know what you think in the poll, but also in the Q&A. And tell me why you answered the way you did. I'll be looking at the responses during the break. Now I'm going to ask my panelists just to turn off their video and go on mute for a few minutes while I invite Liz McMillan, the Chronicle's executive editor, to join us, to interview LaQuia Purcell, who's the Senior Director of Digital Transformation at Ellucian. Liz, over to you.
Oh, thanks so much, Ian. And thanks for a really good conversation so far. And welcome, LaQuia. Thank you so much for being here.
Yes, thank you for having me.
So the survey covered a lot of different points around directions that institutions are pursuing for student success. And I thought it was interesting that Ian just was noting about only 34% strongly agreed with the statement that their institution had a common definition. What stood out to you in the findings?
Yeah, so I'll say that, you know, in my role, I really focus on institutional transformation while supporting system and statewide partnerships to implement like scalable processes that will ultimately increase access, completion, equity. So I appreciated the findings, and I would say I was probably most drawn to the results around data. It's clear to me in the work that I'm doing that we're in the era of data, and it's probably safe to say that that's the new currency in higher education, especially as we evolve to be completely student and learner centered. So there was one question that caught my eye, and it was that retention rates, graduation rates, and surveys of students were the top three metrics that institutions use. And so I appreciated that question around current use, because it naturally leads to the question of, okay, so which points and metrics do we have the opportunity to use, to utilize? So as I looked at the results, I scrolled down to the bottom of the list, and the use of student services was like the last one that was listed, which really highlighted the increased opportunity that we have to be proactive with the use of data. So, you know, the use of resources is that point out, not declaring a major. I love learning about schools that use first gen status to be proactive in areas like classroom content delivery. All our opportunities to be really proactive as we think about how we want to utilize data. I like to say that we really have this opportunity to lean into this 360 degree view. So really bringing data together to create a full picture, a full student picture, so that faculty and staff can offer the timely and really thorough support that our learners need every step of the way. And I think I'll just wrap that up. I think Dr. Hernandez, when she talked about we have to get out of being data hoarders, we do have an opportunity to use those data analytics in ways that can impact learners in the way that they most need it. So that stood out to me. And then I think just the other point, Ian mentioned that to the question of what are the barriers to make student success and institutional priority, that the very first one was budget constraints and funding. And I think, he's right in that that's a harder one to solve for. But it's been very interesting for me to see how institutions have really leveraged collective impact. So through small cohorts or higher ed systems coming together, consortiums forming to get the funding that they need to work together and maximize impact on student success. I think that there are a lot of statewide attainment goals, social mobility, economic development initiatives that are really rooted in student success. And so those are all great opportunities to think about funding those transformational student priorities that we have on campus.
That's a really good point about the collective impact, but I also really liked your idea about data being the new currency in higher ed. And related to that, I thought it was interesting that there was, in terms of where institutions are directing their funds, there was a pretty low ranking for career outcomes on metrics that institutions use. Did that strike you as unusual as well?
It struck me as unusual, especially since we are seeing higher ed and industry partners so tightly together. That is, I would say, one of the reasons why we are fighting for our reputation. So yes, it definitely struck me. And I think, to your point, we really have an opportunity to focus more there.
Mm-hmm. So just beyond the survey more broadly, what are some of the opportunities and challenges that you see institutions facing as they pursue all these different kinds of student success initiatives?
So my role really focuses on digital transformation, which is defined as the shifting of people, processes, technology, and how we use and analyze data. And I can honestly say that sometimes the biggest challenge in the pursuit of student success initiatives is really having the resources and the support to get a truly innovative idea off the ground. We have a lot of great ideas, and it's hard to shift people. And I think someone mentioned before that you have to shift mindsets. It's not enough to change the org chart. So I think really thinking through how we can work again together to move things along, and thinking outside of the box is an opportunity that we have when trying to maximize our impact on students. Again, that might be across institutions where you're partnering with other like institutions in a cohort form. It might be partnering with the labor market to make sure that you're agile and you're, doing away with courses that you no longer need, but bringing in those courses and majors that are going to attract businesses to the state. It may be being able to share data up to those decision makers that can make sure that we have the right initiatives in place to better support students. So I think we have a lot of opportunity to be innovative and to think about our partnerships.
And I think what you were talking about was essentially a paradigm shift. LaQuia, I want to thank you so much for your time, and also for Lucian underwriting this survey. I'm going to hand things back to Ian.
Hey, thanks, Liz. Thanks, LaQuia. I really appreciate it. I'll bring my panel back on, but I really appreciate everyone who's been answering the poll as well. I'll share the results here with everybody. Most folks said somewhat agree on the poll. So 54% of you said that you have somewhat agree that your institution has a good definition. There's a really great debate going on in the Q&A, a really good discussion, kind of about the use of language and how you're making sure sometimes it can be too vague, and making sure what you're thinking about is also measurable. So I really do appreciate everyone who is contributing to the Q&A, and I've been looking at that, and I'm looking forward to seeing more comments come in. I did want to get to one comment here, kind of dovetailing off of what Liz was talking about here a second ago in terms of career services, but a comment here from someone named Gabriel, an attendee, and he says that super excited to hear that Texas State is thinking about post-completion student success. What are some of the metrics being used to track post-completion success, and what data collection efforts are being used to gather this information? Cynthia, I want to ask you that, but I also want to mention, I think both John and Greg and Sarah as well all mentioned that career preparedness and that first job and beyond perhaps are part of that student success. I think, just to be honest with you, sometimes at the Chronicle, we focus so much on who gets in and whether they graduate, and those retention rates and those other institutional measures as signs of student success. But there's obviously this other one about just being ready for your career and life. So Cynthia, sorry, back to you. The question being from Gabriel, kind of like, hey, what are you looking at in terms of the metrics in order to say, hey, we're doing pretty well with this, or something we need to work on?
Sure. Well, and as John and Greg both mentioned, right, this calling to assist our students with social mobility, right? And so it's not just a matter of attaining the degree, but how are they then either applying the degree or applying the knowledge gained while at our institution to further, right, their goals post-graduation. For some students, right, and we'll continue to look at entrance into graduate and professional schools, right? First destination surveys are important for us to really kind of start to measure that, which is right. We administer those right when students are graduating, as well as that first position as well. Some of the other ways that we might look at this and look if we're making movement on it is around utilization of career services, resources, job placements, career attendance at career fairs, those types of things. Again, preparing students to be able to get to the next level of success. Alumni surveys are the other ones, right? Some institutions do those 5-10 years out, really kind of checking in with alumni to see where are they in their pathway. There's a number of other surveys out there that help inform some of this, and some are done by third parties, right? When we think about, and I think Gallup at one time did one around engagement in the workplace, right? And what experiences did students have in their during their collegiate time that really makes them more effective and impactful and really enjoying their workplace, right? So some of those feed into how we do some of that as well. The last piece I'll kind of talk about too, for us, especially with first generation students and the student demographics that we're working with, really we're starting to focus on shifting to this adopting internships as part of what we do, whether it's job shadowing for those who can't take time off to do the internships, or internships as well, helping our students understand the value of those and the pathways that it can provide as well for those who are looking at and choosing to go into the workforce post-graduation. I'll stop there.
No, Cynthia, I appreciate that. Greg, John, I want to see if you have anything to add there in terms of like what you look at. Cynthia was pretty covered the bases. John, looks like you might want to say something.
Yeah. So again, yeah. So metrics again, we're mostly relying on surveys and some scraping. I'll say that, but I will add, like Cynthia at Texas State, not so much adding internships, but we have a longstanding partnerships with a great organization called Braven that we've worked with for quite a number of years. And in addition to investments in our career development center, really kind of moving from kind of nuts and bolts sort of interactive to more of a pedagogical focus on supporting students. Braven has helped us. There's a class that's starting next fall. All of our students will be enrolled in. We're starting actually in the spring with transfer students because they're the ones who have expressed the most kind of anxiety about job transitions. And they say they focus so much on focusing on the transfer in the end of their second and third year. They don't have time to focus on internships. So, but it's really works with creating a network, almost posse-like. Across the country in support of first generation students, as well as doing some great leadership work and other skills on the that are useful on the job market. And we're really happy that we're going to be able to make this available for all of our students. And we've seen great results from it so far. Again, especially with BIPOC and first generation students, and we're looking to expand it to our student body.
Thanks for that addition, John. I appreciate that. I do want to move on quickly here Because we have a question from Robert that dovetails with some things that came up in the survey as well. So Robert asks, do we think, or have we experienced a student success definition divide between faculty and staff? And I'll just point out that in our survey, we had 38% of the respondents disagreed that their faculty understood their role in student success. So again, 38%, almost 40% of respondents disagreed that their faculty understood what their role is in student success. So it's a tough one. Anyone have any kind of want to add to this conversation about how faculty see their role? It's a very important one, but it has been one that sometimes can be a challenge in terms of how they think of student success and how that may be different than what the institution is thinking. I'm going to go with the first raised hand on this. John, go ahead.
Yeah. If you don't mind, I mean, so I would say quickly, I don't see it so much as a disagreement. I mean, I think that as I mentioned, we felt like at our institution, given the large number of Pell recipients and the large number of first generation students, we actually felt like we had to do a lot as an institution before we could really ask faculty to think about changing practices and doing things differently. We having come from that background, again, just couldn't ask people, if people were going to faculty members saying, well, I don't have anywhere to live, I don't have, I can't get enough to eat, asking faculty to really change what they were doing in the classroom just didn't make any sense. So we really needed to focus on a lot of things extra institutionally, and we're working closely with faculty who are mostly just focusing on what's going on in the classroom and what kind of academic outcomes are, and again, doing a great job, I think, of doing it. But so I don't think it's necessarily different definitions. It's a bit more contextual.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Maybe not a divide, as Robert was sort of putting, at least for your campus. Cynthia, Greg, I'm just curious how you might respond to that too, just how you work with faculty, maybe change the question from, is there a divide, to question of, hey, how do you work with faculty to make sure they're thinking about student success as part of their role more broadly? If they don't already, I should be careful here in presuming that there's some big change in consensus there that has to happen.
Yeah, I might take a slightly different tact and just, first, I think it's a fascinating question. The survey results, I think, were really interesting. And I would suggest that I think most of our faculty and staff truly do support our student success and believe that they are supporting our student success. Coming back to that, like different definitions across different people, I think that plays into it. But I also have noticed this phenomenon in which a lot of the actions and behaviors we associate with harming students or negatively impacting student success, I think, are rooted in this desire to protect students from harm and from failure. And so it makes me think like that I think there is a role for adversity and for failure within success, right? And helping students navigate that. That's the sort of that grit argument, right? And I think there is an element of that denying students the opportunity to fail is also denying them the opportunity to grow and learn from that adversity, and to see adversity as something that they can overcome, and it sort of impacts their self-efficacy and so on. And so I see this show up in like increasingly legalistic court syllabi statements and policies, encouraging students to withdraw versus taking the grade that they might have earned, and just other types of course placement and admission policies and practices and so on. And I think if we expand our definition and the ways in which we approach it, I think we would include more students in our daily interactions and maybe help them grow and succeed.
I really appreciate that point, Greg. And Sarah, I wonder if you had any comment on sort of the idea of including student failure within student success. I know that's sort of a really broad brush way of saying it, but just the idea of making sure you also, and you can also please do comment on the other things we brought up too. I don't mean to cut it off, but just want to hear your kind of comment on that idea of how do you, when you think about student success, thinking about making sure that the students also have the opportunity to fail and grow.
Yeah, absolutely. I actually was really excited we took on this question because I saw it in the chat and it was one of the ones that made me most excited. I'll tell you, one of the top 3 questions we get in the work of the center is, how do you better support faculty in doing work for first generation students? How do you help them teach in the classrooms for first gen students? And we can come back to that. I think we have to support students through failure in the same way we do through success. Things are going to happen. We cannot retain every single student. We can do our best, but there's sometimes, to the point that Greg made, sometimes a student does have to take the grade they earned. Sometimes, a situation happens that we have to support them through. I think sometimes that means helping them understand that stopping out is a right decision and then there's a pathway to come back, and we have to support them through coming back to the institution. I've heard great stories of institutions saying, you're going to leave for a little bit, but we're gonna check in on you. We're gonna make sure that you get to come back. And we don't like to talk about that side of higher education very often, but it's an important part of the work that we do is helping, because that's also the real world. Things are going to happen in the workplace. Things are going to happen in your family, and you've got to build that that sense of resilience. That comes along with this work sometimes. But I wanted to circle back just for a moment to this
Please,
faculty
yeah.
conversation. I do think that sometimes we're not always inviting faculty into the student success conversations. It's really easy when we go into work with an institution. You can fill a table really quickly with all the supports and services at an institution, but then they go, where are the faculty? Oh, we should invite some of them. It sometimes is a bit of a second thought. And so thinking about how we can help faculty feel more confident in classrooms. I'm not saying you have to be the one that then after class takes them all out to figure out where they're going to manage food insecurity from. Knowing about where those resources are at the institution is really important. We do a lot of work around professional development for faculty about teaching and learning in the classrooms. We also help do work around things like dismantling jargon. You may have heard the conversation that's happened over the last couple of years around stopping to use the term office hours in favor of student hours. Students thought that office hours meant you were in your office working and don't bother you, but you actually can create spaces to make that more available to students. The other thing that's really interesting to me is some institutions are placing aggregate informational course rosters. About 40% of the students in your classroom are first generation. 8% are student athletes, sort of a list of information. And then we're helping faculty understand what does it mean to teach. So you're a student success provider in your classroom, teaching, working within your discipline. Doesn't mean you've got to be on 73 committees at your institution at the same time. So thanks for letting me circle back to that for a moment.
No, Sarah, it's a really important point. I appreciate that. And those are all great points to make. I'm going to come back to that topic. Cynthia, I want to give a chance to, actually, I'm going to let you have a chance to respond to that too, because I do think it's just too important for us to move on. So go ahead.
Sure. No, I agree with what John said. It's a both and, right? We have to be attentive to those base blocks of Maslow's hierarchy, right, before we can get into some of the other, and not necessarily before. We've got to be doing them both at the same time, right? We've got to be looking at how faculty and the environments are setting in their classrooms and the relationships they're building with their students. And Sarah hit the nail on the head in that you bring faculty in from the beginning, right? And your commissions, your task forces, your conversations. I have a faculty advisory council that I meet with monthly, just to continue to talk through these things, right, with representatives from each of the colleges. Sarah alluded to faculty champions early on, the importance of that, but also, right, perhaps unveiling a little bit to faculty how regular practices and in the classrooms might be creating stress for students, and just that awareness, right? The University of Texas and University of Washington put out a faculty handbook around mental health and well-being, which we know is the #1 issue for our students at this point. In fact, how faculty can help in reducing and or addressing, so being proactive as well as reactive on that topic. And I think for us, that's a lot of the conversation that we can involve faculty in. And then I just want to echo that what Greg was talking about in terms of resilience or grit, helping students understand they have agency over their own student success as well, is important too.
Yeah, we got some folks who are echoing Greg's comment and appreciating that, the idea of those opportunities and giving them the opportunity. And again, I think your word is a good one too, Cynthia, giving them agency. We've only got a few minutes left here. I do want to make sure I get to this topic because it's so important. And this is working not with faculty, but with advisors, and depending on how you associate or how you've set up your advising. I know this could be a whole hour, if not a longer conversation, but we have a question here from David, and he asked, Could panel comment on their experience regarding centralized advising versus decentralized advising conducted by college or department? What model works best for student success measures? That really depends on your institution. I do just want to mention that when it comes to advising, this was the area that most respondents in our survey, perhaps not surprising, were investing money, and the area they felt was the highest need for a better strategy. So I know, again, this is putting you all on the spot. I would love to kind of talk about, hey, how are you approaching this issue of advising, and any suggestions, and hey, how do we improve it? There's lots of work has gone into this, working with professional advisors instead of faculty advisors in some cases. Quickly around the horn on this one, John, I was going to see if you had any comments just on how you all think about this issue of advising and working with students.
Sure, I can be pretty quick on this because I have to say this is actually for us, it's the kind of the tail on the dog. This is the last area of focus for us. We've been doing a lot of work, as I said, on affordability, a lot of work on classroom climate and engagement. Our faculty have really stepped up and have done a lot of work, and we're only right now at the point of thinking about what we need to do to change advising. And again, a lot of it will be, again, really just thinking what we are providing institutionally to support not just the advisors, but also the students, and the students as well as the advisors, so that it's not as kind of individualized and kind of atomic as it is now. But exactly what direction we're going to go in is not something that I think that collectively we have decided. So that's a work in progress for us.
Yeah, like many institutions, it sounds like from the survey results. Cynthia, Greg, I didn't know if you had any comments on that, how you think about advising, perhaps changes, or perhaps what changes, like John said, hey, we're in an area we're still thinking about and we're trying to get to.
Yeah, I feel like in some ways we're kind of going back to the basics. And I kind of back to the beginning of this conversation and the student belonging literature and research. There was this great book that came out a couple of years ago by Leo Lambert called Relationship Rich Education. And it's just chock full of really good ideas and practices, and an easy read too. So ding. But yeah, it's all about like cultivating those relationships with students, and it's all hands on deck work, right? I think all employees have a role in that, depending on how you're defining advising, right? I think there's some programmatic type of advising that we house specifically within an advising office. But I feel like asking students who they are, what their goals are, connecting them with resources on campus, that's everybody's work. And all of that to me sort of fits within this bucket of advising.
Interesting point. I appreciate that, Greg, as well. Cynthia, Sarah, any comments on advising? I know this could be a whole hour, if not longer, discussion about how to improve it by itself. And I've given you, a minute or so here. Cynthia?
Yeah, sure. No, I echo my colleagues on here in that this is an issue that we're continuing to look at and really trying to identify a model that's going to work for us. We have over 10,000 new students coming in. We're very fortunate in the state of Texas to see growing numbers of students wanting to come to our campus. But whatever we do, we have to be able to scale our advising efforts in a way that can meet some of that demand by utilizing new technologies, by perhaps repurposing or looking at the different positions. How do we have other positions that complement advising efforts? I think at one time, we wanted advisors to have magic lassos and capes, right? We put everything on their broad shoulders and expecting them to fix the student success effort. And they are a key piece of it. But we also have to recognize and be able to integrate the rest of the folks around campus who are also doing this work so that we are appropriately distributing that workload. So we're still looking at it. One piece that I've been successful at my previous institution, one is having somebody actually not necessarily in charge and that all advisors report to, but someone in charge of making sure advisors are getting the professional development they need, the onboarding, the continuous education, the recognition and so on, right? And then also advocating for university-wide tools that will help advisors in their work as well. So, it's a profession into itself, and we've got to be able to figure out how to support those who are doing this work.
I appreciate that. Sarah, I do want to make sure.
Yeah, really quickly.
Yeah, no, but you also put out, everybody know, you put a resource that we put out in the chat. We're also make sure everyone gets access to the resource, which was the Advising Success Network. We're going to make sure everyone gets access to that in the email as well afterward. But Sarah, please make sure you get a final comment here.
Yeah, I just wanted to build upon what Cynthia shared around professional development. You know, a few years ago in the center, we had a national study on first generation supports. And what came out of that was, you know, about 80% of institutions were collecting data on first gen students, but only about 20% at that time were actually putting it in the student information system. And we pushed in on that a little bit and said, what's going on there? And they said, well, we're worried that folks who are working with students might use that in a way that's not helpful, not intentionally, but might say things like, oh, you're first generation, maybe you should only take 12 credit hours instead of 15, or maybe you shouldn't be in this major. And that became a real concern for us. And so I think in addition to professional development around being an advisor, it's also about how do you navigate the intersectional identities and the lived experiences of the students you're serving, and how do we grow that work? And that's something really important to me in that space as well. So I'll stop there.
Sarah, I appreciate it. I know there's so much more to discuss with all of you, and I really appreciate your time, though, and I don't want to hold you on too long, but I really appreciate all the comments we made today, that you all made today. Really interesting. I see a couple of people commenting on some of the idea that Greg mentioned about mindsets. I think about what Cynthia said about communication